Several years ago, I went on a journey to England to follow in the footsteps of John Wesley. And it was from that journey, from that pilgrimage, that I was inspired to develop and write the sermon series that we just finished last week on our Methodist heritage and the Methodist movement, not just here, but also in Britain. While on that pilgrimage, I met a man by the name of Christian Kuhn. He was and is still a pastor in Chicago. And I also discovered just this past week that he is also a blogger, which I didn't know when I met him back a couple of years ago. He blogs for a publication called The Christian Century, and he published the following on December 15th in 2008 when he wrote about a Christmas pageant at his church. Now, you know how the story goes with Christmas pageants, right? You announce it, and a time comes to plan, and kids just come out of the woodwork wanting to be a part of it. And that's great. We love that. They come for the chance to sing and dance and dress up like angels and shepherds and farm animals. But when it comes to casting the main characters in the story, that's when things get a little competitive. And that was part of what Chris shared in his blog from December of 2008. He wrote, "Our music director asked a group of 7, 8, and 9-year-old girls, 'Who wants to be Mary?' He asked them that question a couple of weeks before as the children were coming to church and gathered for their first rehearsal of the Christmas pageant. Well, a handful of would-be Marys eagerly raised their hands, each wanting the chance to stand up at the front of the church and hold that baby doll Jesus. Well, apparently, after a bit of deliberation, the director chose a second grader named Sophie for the part. Sophie's eyes opened up wide behind her glasses," Chris wrote, "and she whispered in joyful disbelief, 'Me?' Sophie was obviously thrilled that she had been chosen to be Mary in the pageant. Now, the other girls were understandably disappointed. Why? Because as Chris concluded in his blog, everybody wants to be Mary. And you know, it's true. Everybody wants to be Mary, even though we don't know a lot about her. Only that she was chosen as a young woman. She was a young woman chosen by God to give birth to God's Son, Jesus. But when we combine some of the historical evidence that we know about that time period, and we partner that with the biblical narrative, we get a pretty good picture of who Mary really was. According to biblical scholars, it is likely that Mary came from a poor, unassuming family. A family who lived in Nazareth, which was a small village in Israel. Scholars also believe that she was probably a girl in her teens, perhaps not much older than age 13, which was the age that young women were typically married in the ancient Near East. It is also likely that she was not an educated girl, because only the boys went to synagogue to be schooled. And so she would not have gone to school, but she was a young woman of profound faith. We also know that Mary was betrothed to a man named Joseph, someone that we know even less about. And it was probably an arranged marriage. So it is against this backdrop that Mary received an unexpected visitor, an unexpected announcement. "Peace be with you. The Lord is with you. The Lord has greatly blessed you," the angel proclaimed. Now, according to the scripture, apparently this troubled Mary. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, would you be troubled if an angel showed up and started shouting at you? Well, then the angel goes on and announces that in due time, Mary will become pregnant. and the child that she will bear will be known as the Son of God. And she is to name him Yeshua, which in Aramaic means God helps, God saves, or God delivers. The angel goes on to say, your son will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High God. The Lord will make him a king, and his kingdom will never end. Sounds pretty exciting, doesn't it? Well, maybe. Let's put it into perspective, shall we? Mary is about to become an unwed mother, which in the ancient Near East is risky business. In those days, a young woman who is engaged or betrothed to a man is considered to have entered into a legal contract, even though the marriage ceremony has not taken place. She will also continue to live in her father's house while her husband prepares the home that they will share together. She is not allowed to be physically intimate with any man, including her husband or her would-be husband, until their actual wedding day, when she is formally and ritually brought to the house that has been prepared for her by her husband, and their marriage is sealed together. In other words, until that point, she is a virgin. What's more, if a woman who is betrothed and has entered into that contract is found to be pregnant before the marriage is sealed, she is considered an adulteress. And by law, which we find in Deuteronomy, is subject to stoning by her community. In other words, she is to be stoned to death along with her partner in crime and their unborn child. Now, let's assume for the sake of argument that Mary is able to avoid that fate. Ultimately, she has to tell Joseph that she is pregnant, right? And when she does, well, the ball is in his court. And in order to save face or retain his reputation, he very well might break the contract. He might break everything off, call off the wedding. He could do this publicly, or even if he divorces her quietly, as the scripture later says, eventually her family and friends, probably most likely the entire village, they are likely to find out that she is pregnant in due time. And knowing that her marriage to Joseph is no more, the least they would have done was to shun her and treat her like an outcast. So, to recap, if Mary agrees to the plan that has been laid out by the angel, she could lose her husband, she could lose her friends, she could lose her family, she could lose her reputation. Indeed, she could even lose her life. So who wants to be Mary now? Yeah. Well, when we read the account of the Annunciation, that is the unexpected announcement by the angel Gabriel of Mary's pregnancy, we discover that Mary had a choice. Yes, Gabriel said to her, "You will become pregnant and give birth to a son." But Mary could have said, "No thanks, I think I'll pass." She could have said like Moses did, "Please God, choose somebody else." Or she could have done what Jonah did when he got on the next boat headed in the opposite direction, instead of confronting the Ninevites in Nineveh about their wicked and evil ways. In other words, Mary could have run the other way. Or she could have said, as Jeremiah did, "I don't think so, God. I am too young." But Mary didn't do or say any of those things. Instead, the scripture tells us that she proclaimed, "I am the Lord's servant. May it happen to me as you have said." Even though the minuses outnumbered the pluses, even though the cons outnumbered the pros. Mary said, yes, I'll do it. Mary said yes to God. When was the last time you were called by God to do something? Maybe something you didn't want to do, or something that was dangerous or unexpected. Did that calling come to you as a whisper or a nudge? Was it a still small voice? And how did you respond? Did you say no? Or did you say yes? Did you say, I'm not good enough? Send somebody else? Or did you say to God, send me? Did you say, I'm sorry, I'm too old, or too young, or too busy? Or did you say, I may not think I'm the right person for this, but God, I will give it my best shot? Did you make excuses? Or did you say, here I am? When our children were little, I first felt God's call upon my life. I was serving as an adult leader for an elementary camp up at the United Methodist Camp on Mingus Mountain that many of you have probably seen. I had finished all of my preparations for the week, and I decided I needed to have some quiet time. So I went to the outdoor chapel to just sit before the 100 or so children started showing up for the camp. And as I sat there listening as the breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, I felt God nudging me. I didn't know at the time what those nudges meant. Then I clearly heard a voice inside my head, and I've learned since that that's the way that God talks to me. And that voice inside my head said, I've got something I want you to do. It wasn't until many years later that I discerned that that something was devoting the rest of my life to full-time ministry as a pastor. And although it took a while, I eventually did say yes to God's call. Like Mary, I said, here I am, use me as you will. In his book called The Journey, Walking the Road to Bethlehem, Reverend Adam Hamilton writes about God's call. Sometimes God asks us to be with people we don't want to be with, to go to places we don't want to go to, and to do things we don't want to do. This is part of what Mary's story teaches us. Mary is twice said to be favored by God, and yet God's favor meant not a life of bliss, but a life of risk for her. It must have been hard to imagine, he goes on, that this was what it meant to be favored by God. Part of the invitation of Advent is to offer ourselves completely to God, just as Mary did. Christmas is not about how much we buy or how much we eat or whom we visit. It's about our willingness to say with Mary, here am I, Lord. Use me according to your will. When God called Mary to be the mother of God's Son, she could have said no, but she didn't. Instead, she said yes, even though it was inconvenient and it didn't fit into her plans. She could have said yes, or she did say yes, even though she could have ended up becoming an unwed mother, shunned by her would-be husband, her family, her friends, and her community. Mary said yes, even though it was dangerous and could have resulted in her death. Even though the deck was stacked against her, Mary said yes when God called. Will you?